Hello everyone, and welcome back to the 10 Days of JavaScript. Here we are in day number 8, and in this lesson we are going to talk about scope and context. So what is scope and what is context? Well, here are my own sarcastic definitions. So I would say that scope is the biggest source of confusion regarding variables, and my definition for context would be the biggest source of confusion regarding objects. Now, these tongue-in-cheek definitions are not actually helpful, but right away they do let us know that scope has to do with variables and context has to do with objects. But beyond that, let's dive deeper. So let's start with scope, and then in the second half of this lesson, we can cover context. Now, instead of trying to explain scope with only words, let's work through a few examples together where we can see scope in action. So imagine we have a variable. I'm going to say let my name equal a string of text. And now let's try to access this variable from within a function. So maybe down here, let's create a brand new function. You can name it whatever you want. I'm going to name it maybe amazing function, parentheses, curly brackets. And just as an example, let's try to log out to the console the my name variable, just to see if we have access to it. So console.log my name. Okay, and then let's actually call or execute this function to test it out. So on a new line, we can just call that function, amazing function. Okay, now if we check the console, awesome. Now this is just review. We've already done this before, so the question is, why am I showing this to you? Well, it's because the topic of scope has to do with where we can access a variable from. Let me show you what I mean. So this code is working perfectly, but what if we move this first line of code here? What if we cut and paste it to live within the function? Let's try that out. Let's cut this first line into our clipboard. And then inside the body of our function, maybe right above the console line, paste in your clipboard. Okay, and then let's cut and paste this console.log line. Let's cut that into our clipboard. And let's move it down below this function call. Now at first glance, as a beginning programmer, we would think that this would work, right? We've got this function that's going to create a variable named my name. Then we are calling the function, so we know that that code is going to get executed. So we would think that we would be able to log out to the console my name. But if I check the console, we just see a big error message that says my name is not defined. So we just smashed our head up against a brick wall, and this is our first example of running into an issue with scope. Now, before we worry about what the word scope means in this sense, let's first answer the question as to why this code is not working. Why are we receiving that error message in the console? Well, it's because within the body of this function, or I should say within this block of code, within these curly brackets, as far as variables are concerned, we are in our own little new world that is separate or private from the outside world. So we would say that this variable is scoped to this block, these curly brackets, meaning it cannot be accessed from outside the block. So down here, when we try to access that variable, as far as this line of code is concerned, this variable doesn't even exist. Now let me put things back to the way they were at the beginning of the lesson and explain why that was working. So let me cut the variable line back up out of the function, up at the very top here, and let me cut and paste the console.log line back into the function. Now this code will work just fine. It works because up on this line, when we are creating the variable, we are not inside a block or any curly brackets, right? We are just out in the open in what we would call the global scope. This works because scope is like a one-way street. The traffic only flows in one direction. Code can reach outwards to access a variable, but it cannot reach inwards. Now, don't worry, I don't expect you to understand what I just said. That's why we're going to work through a new example right now to understand what I mean by inwards and outwards. So right now, make sure your code looks like mine. If you need to pause the video for a second to catch up, that's okay. Inside our function, I want you to cut the console.log line. So just cut it into your clipboard, and in its place, let's write an if statement. So let's say if, parentheses, for the condition, why don't we say if 2 plus 2 double equal sign 4, right? Because we know that will always be true. Right after these parentheses, let's include curly brackets and drop down. And now inside the if statement, let's just paste back in the console.log line. Okay, now if I check the console, we see that things are working just like before the if statement. So you might be wondering why I even added this if statement at all. Well, it's because it's a great example to explain what I mean when I say that scope begins inwards and moves outwards. Right? That analogy when I said that scope is a one-way street. So when this line of code runs, JavaScript's first instinct is to see if there is a myName variable as close to home as possible, meaning within this scope, within this block, within the curly brackets for the if statement. So just as a quick test, within the if statement, right above the console.log line, if I say let myName equal Brad the third, and then check the console, we see Brad the third. However, if we either delete this line or just put 2 forward slashes to comment it out and pretend that it's deleted, if JavaScript sees that there is no myName variable within the current local scope, well, it's then going to look up the scope chain or look one level outside of itself. So outside of this scope, the next closest scope is within the body of our function. So just as a test, if we said let myName equal Brad Jr. and check the console, we see Brad Jr. Okay, and then finally, if we either deleted this line or just got rid of it with 2 forward slashes, JavaScript would say, okay, there's no myName inside the local block. There's no myName in the block that's one level up. Why don't we check another level up from that? And that would finally land us in the global scope, and it would see that, aha, that variable exists. So if we check the console, it's back to just Brad. So the idea is that when a line of code runs and you're looking for a variable, JavaScript is first going to look for that variable as close to home as possible within the current scope. If it's not there, it's just going to keep moving up the scope chain one level at a time until it finds what it's looking for. Now, it's important that we really understand what's going on here. So really quick, this is not a case of these lines overriding or updating this original variable. That is not what's happening. Even though these 3 variables of myName all have the same identifier or label name, they are 3 completely independent and separate variables. Let me show you not only how we can prove that, but also what I mean. Because I remember when I first learned programming, and I saw an example like this, I actually misinterpreted it and saw it backwards. I saw it as, okay, we're creating the variable in the global scope, and then we are updating the variable in this scope, and then we're updating it again in this scope. That is not the case. These are 3 completely separate variables. And I can prove that to you by removing the slashes to uncomment out these 2 lines. So let's get rid of the slash here, and then get rid of the slash here. And now let's do this. Within our innermost block of code, within the if statement, inside the console.log, let's begin by saying inside the if statement, and then a comma, and then output our variable. Okay, now right after the if statement, but still within our function, so right here, let's log out to the console and say inside our function, and then comma, and then our variable. And then finally, down at the very bottom, on the last line of code, after we call the function, So we are in the global scope now. Let's log out to the console and say in the global scope, and then comma, and then output my name. Okay, now if we check the console, we see inside the if statement is one variable with its value. Inside our function is a different variable with its own value. And in the global scope, that's another variable with a different value. What was the point of this experiment? It's to show you that these are three completely separate variables. Even though they have the same identifier or label, it doesn't matter. The let statement creates a variable within the current local scope. It does not matter if that identifier or label name has been used in outer scope. Remember that inside a block of code, inside these curly brackets, it's like our own new private little world as far as variables are concerned. Meaning it's almost like we get a clean slate. We can reuse the same variable names, and JavaScript knows that we do not want to affect any of the variables in outer scope. We just want to create a brand new separate variable that is scoped to this block. Now, you might be scratching your head right now and wondering, well, what if we wanted to mutate the global original variable from within our innermost block? Is there a way we can do that? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Just to save confusion, why don't we get rid of this let my name equal Brad Jr. line. And let's also get rid of the two console.log lines within our function. Okay, now within the if statement, what if we wanted to update or mutate or change the value of the global scoped my name variable? Well, all we would need to do is remove the word let from this line of code. The let statement says create a new variable for this local scope. But if we get rid of let, now we are just trying to work or access the variable, and we're setting it to equal something. So here's what JavaScript's going to do. It's going to see this variable and ask itself, does this variable already exist within this current local scope? It doesn't, so then it's going to look one level up, just within the function. It's going to see that it doesn't exist there either, and then it's going to check one level up, and it's going to say, okay, it does exist in the global scope. That must be what you're talking about right here. So I'm going to let you update or change that variable. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said that scope moves in one direction. It's a one-way street. Inside code can reach outwards for variables, but outside code cannot reach inside for variables. So long story short, we set it to equal Brad the third, and now down here where we are logging out to the console in the global scope, and then our variable, if we check the console, we see Brad the third. Awesome. Now before we switch gears in this lesson and move on to the second half and talk about context instead of scope, there's one more scope related thing we need to cover. So throughout this course, when we've been creating or declaring a variable, we've been using the word let. However, until about 3 or 4 years ago, there was no let in JavaScript. And instead, we had to create variables by saying var and then the label or identifier, and otherwise the syntax is the same, right? So if you're looking at older code or if you inherit a project from someone, you might see var being used instead of let. Now there are several subtle differences between var and let, but right now I want to show you the one big, huge, glaring difference between the two. The biggest difference between var and let is that let uses block scope, whereas var uses function scope. So what in the world does that mean? Let me show you. So within our if statement, at the beginning of this line of code, if we put the word let here, we know that that's going to create a variable that is scoped to this block, right? Scoped to the if statement's curly brackets. So let is going to look for the nearest enclosing block. And a block can be several different things, right? We know that an if statement uses a block, these curly brackets. We know that a while loop uses the curly brackets in a block. Clearly, the body of a function uses a block. Okay, but the idea here is that let is going to make it so that this variable is only accessible from within the nearest enclosing block. So right now, we would not be able to access the variable right here outside of the if statement. However, if we changed this to a var instead of a let, var uses function scope instead of block scope. So var is going to say, you know what? I don't care that the if statement has curly brackets and that it's a block. Since I'm a var, I only care about the curly brackets of a function, right? Because var uses function scope instead of block scope. This means that this var variable is accessible anywhere inside its enclosing function, even outside of the if statement. So we could access my name right here within the function. Now, again, historically, that's how we created variables in JavaScript, but in the last 3 or 4 years, JavaScript finally got access to let. And the reason that 99% of developers use the word let instead of var is because almost all other programming languages besides JavaScript use block scope instead of function scope. Block scope is just what most of us are used to. It's a paradigm that we are familiar with, and it's a super popular opinion that block scope leads to less confusing code, less scope confusion, and just less problems overall. So long story short, that's the difference between let and var, but in the current year and looking forward, I encourage you to always use the word let and never, or I should say basically never, use the word var. All right, and that's scope in a nutshell. If you're still a bit confused regarding scope, that's okay. That's completely normal. In fact, I have worked with professional mid-level developers who were even sometimes still confused by scope. Big picture, you do not need to be a scope guru at this point. I just want the topic to be on your radar. It's something you need to be aware of. And if your code isn't working, you might want to double or triple check your scope and make sure your variables are pointing towards what you think they are pointing towards. Remember, you can always use console.log to check the value. Okay, at this point, let's change gears. We've talked about scope. Now let's talk about context. So I'm actually going to delete all of the code that we have and start fresh. And honestly, you might want to pause the video and go take a state-mandated break, maybe get a drink of water, go for a quick walk, or if you have the attention span of a champion, let's keep going. Okay, so scope is about variables. Context is about objects. So with this in mind, let's go ahead and give ourselves an example object to experiment with. So I'm going to create a variable and I'll give it a name of John and set it to equal an object, so curly brackets. Let's give it a property of first name and set it to equal John. And then let's give it another property of last name and give it a value of Doe. Okay, and then let's also give this object a method named driveCar. So driveCar, parentheses, curly brackets. And let's imagine we want this method to log out to the console a bit of text that says, John Doe is driving a car. So console.log, only we don't want to necessarily hard code John into the string of text. Instead, it would make more sense to pull in the value of the first name property, right? Because that way, if in the future they ever legally changed their name to Jonathan or something different, our driveCar method would automatically pull in that value. So the question is, inside of a method like this, right, inside this function that belongs to the object, how can we reference this property? Well, instead of just saying first name, we instead want to say this dot first name. Now, the entire topic of context in JavaScript is centered around the this keyword. I will explain how the this keyword works in just a minute, but first let's finish out our line of code here. So right after first name, let's say plus, and then a string of text with a space in it, and then let's add on their last name. So this dot last name, and then let's add on a string of text that says is driving a car. Okay, now really quick, let's test out this method, and then we can dive into really understanding the this keyword. So maybe down here at the very bottom of our code, below our object, we can say John to work with the object, look inside it with a dot, and then call that method. Drive car, parentheses to call the method, and if we check the console, awesome. We see John Doe is driving a car. Again, this is nothing new. We've done this before. The reason I'm showing it to you this time is because this is a chance to dissect the keyword this. So what in the world does this mean? Well, that's a loaded question. Even some of the best JavaScript developers in the world, if they're being honest, at one point in their career, they were definitely confused by the this keyword. So in our current example, the this keyword is pointing towards our John object. So if we use our imagination, we are basically saying John dot first name, John dot last name, right? We know that to look inside an object, you just say dot and then whichever property you're interested in. Now at this point, you might be thinking, what's the big deal? What's so confusing, right? This seems really straightforward. You might be thinking that within a method, the this keyword simply always points towards the enclosing object. However, that's not the case. So in a search for the truth, let me confuse you on purpose just for a minute to show you why the this keyword gives developers so much trouble. Check this out. Right above this console.log line, but still within our drive car method, let's create a brand new function. So function, and let's name it I'm a function, not a method. Then parentheses, curly brackets. This name is just for fun. You could choose any function name you want, but we are nesting a function inside of this method. And check this out. Inside the body of this function, let's log out to the console the this keyword. Now, currently, this function would never actually run. Right? This is just a function definition or the recipe for the function. So then maybe right below it, why don't we try and call that function? So I'm a function, not a method, parentheses to call it. And if I check the console, right above our John Doe is driving a car, we see this window object. Let's not get too hung up on what window is. For now, I can tell you that in the web browser, window is the root or global object. We could say that it's the top level object that houses or contains all of the web browser's other objects. For now, let's just call window the global object. Now the important concept here is that the this keyword is pointing to two different things at two different times, right? In this context, this line of code that I'm highlighting, the this keyword pointed towards our John object, but then on this line of code, the this keyword is pointing towards the global object. So the million-dollar question, the question that confuses programmers all around the world, the question that they're ripping their hair out of their head over is, how does JavaScript decide what the this keyword should be pointing towards? Well, here's the answer. The this keyword does not point towards the enclosing object. Clearly that's not the case. If that was the case, then this instance of the this keyword would be pointing towards John, but it's not. So the real answer, here it is that the this keyword points towards the object that is executing or calling the current function. Or in other words, instead of focusing on these two lines of code that use the this keyword, so this line and this line, what we should really be focusing on are the two lines of code where we are calling the functions. So this line and this line. On this line of code, the object that is calling or executing the function is the John object. So that's the object that the this keyword is going to point towards inside that function. Now here's where the confusion comes from. You might be thinking to yourself, well, hey, this line of code lives inside that drive car function, so why on this line of code is the this keyword also not pointing towards John? Well, the answer is because that's not the context in which this function is actually being called or executed. The only reason that this function ever actually runs is because we are calling it right here. Now on this line of code, it's painfully obvious which object is calling or executing the driveCar function, or we should say the driveCar method. But on this line of code, it's not as obvious, right? It's not like there's an object right in front of it and then a dot. So in cases like this, when we are calling a regular old function, JavaScript essentially says, you know what? Let's say that it's the global object that is calling or executing this function. So that's what the this keyword gets set to when the function runs. Don't worry, I do not expect you to fully grasp this yet. My only goal right now is for you to just be aware that the this keyword exists, that what it points towards changes depending on the context, and that it's a source of confusion for developers of all different skill levels, not just beginners. In the future, when you are creating applications, I guarantee that you're going to run into the this keyword. And I can also guarantee that at some point, your code is not going to work the way that you want it to work. And there's a good chance that it's because the this keyword is not pointing towards what you think it's pointing towards. Don't worry, this is a concept that we can review and practice again later on in the course. Now, really quick, before we bring this lesson to a close, I want to answer the question of why. Why does the this keyword even exist? We just spent a lot of energy trying to understand how to use it, but what about why we would use it? So let's give ourselves a quick goal. Now, right now, we just have this one object named John, but imagine we had 500 other objects that represented people and cats and dogs. And imagine that we wanted to give all of those objects a method named breathe. And maybe the breathe method logs out to the console a message that says their name, and then it says they just inhaled and exhaled. Now, technically, we could just type out a function like we did for drive car and then copy and paste it into all 500 objects, but that would be terrible code, right? That's super repetitive. So let me show you what else we can do. Maybe down here, let's create a brand new function. So function, let's call it breathe, parentheses, curly brackets. Now, if you're more experienced in programming and you're just watching these lessons as a review, you might be screaming at the screen right now, wondering why I wouldn't just use a prototype or class syntax and inheritance. But those are concepts that we have not gotten to yet in this course, so bear with me. So we've got this new function, and imagine inside it we say console.log, and then to save a bit of typing, we can literally just copy and paste the code that I'm highlighting right now. Right, so up in the drive car method, I'm going to highlight from this until the closing of the quote, and then paste that into our brand new function. And then for the ending part of the string, let's just change it to say, just inhaled and exhaled. Okay, so now we've got this new function named breathe. Now, what if we wanted to let our John object use the breathe function, right? So we would expect it to say, John Doe just inhaled and exhaled. Well, at first glance, this function looks hopeless, right? Because it's a standalone function, not a method that belongs to an object. Meaning, how in the world do we expect this to point towards anything meaningful? If we tried to call or execute the breathe function down here, because it's just a regular old function, JavaScript is going to consider the global object, the object that is calling it. Meaning that's what the this keyword is going to get set to, the global object. And clearly there's no first name and last name properties attached to the global object. However, check this out. Here's an example of why it's so amazing to be comfortable with the this keyword. We can begin with our breathe function, and in JavaScript, a function is an object just like any other object or entity. And functions have access to a method named call. So we can include the name of our function, and then instead of parentheses right after it to call it directly, we can say dot call, And the call method is going to call or execute our function, but not before first giving us a chance to control the this keyword. Meaning whatever we place inside these parentheses here, call will make the this keyword point towards that. So if we want our John object to be able to use the breathe function, well, this function would make a whole lot of sense if the this keyword was pointing towards John, right? So down here inside the call parentheses, let's just pass in our John object. And now if we check the console, awesome. John Doe just inhaled and exhaled. So maybe now you're starting to see the purpose of the this keyword. It allows our code to be flexible. If we had another object named Jane or meows a lot or barks a lot, we could just as easily include that here. And thanks to the this keyword, this function is flexible enough that it would still make sense and work perfectly. In the future, we will learn about other situations where you use the this keyword that are even 10 times more useful than this example. Okay, that's going to bring this lesson to a close. To be fair, you probably didn't need to know this much about scope and context this early on in your JavaScript career. I usually try to err on the side of protecting you from complicated topics early on, but really I just feel like scope and context are such a common source of confusion for developers that even if none of this makes sense right now, we at least planted these seeds in your mind. And maybe a week or two down the road, if your code is not working and you're super confused and frustrated, maybe a little light bulb will go off in your mind and you'll go, aha, maybe it's scope that's causing the problem, or maybe it's context that's causing the problem. And you might even need to come back and re-watch this lesson, but big picture, I think you're going to be happy that you learned about these topics. Cool. Now, looking ahead to our next lesson, we are going to learn about miscellaneous features of the JavaScript language that are super useful, but maybe didn't need an entire video just for themselves. So it's going to be sort of a fun grab bag of useful tips and syntax and tricks. It's going to be a much shorter lesson than this one, I promise you that. So let's keep our momentum rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson. The 10 Days of JavaScript is the first chapter for my upcoming premium course, Full Stack JavaScript from Scratch. I'm making these first 10 or 11 videos freely available on YouTube, and so for the next 10 days, I'm going to upload one new video each day. So stay tuned, or if you're watching this in the future, all the lessons are up, so feel free to binge watch. The full premium course is not available just yet, but if you subscribe to this channel, you'll be notified as soon as it's out. Or if you're watching this video in the future, it's already available. Enjoy!